Well, greeting everyone, and thanks for joining us for the next of the form and fabric in early medieval Britain, and this celebration of the work of our colleague Ewan Campbell. And I just want to share one screen somewhere. Here it is. And as we start, I just want to, well, we can have the, come on. So just two things really. If you were unable to attend the first one, or if you just want to relive it, it's now posted on the research page of the archaeology department on the School of Humanities, and there's a link up here, but you should just be able to find it. This is a screenshot I just took earlier today. And the other thing, which is just a kind of event which seems worth mentioning in this context, is that yesterday I got this photograph sent to me by our editor at the CBA, and so Royal Fortiva actually exists. At least there is at least one copy of this book out there, we know. So anyway, I just want to, so that's obviously Ewan's work carrying on. Now, what I'd like to do now is to introduce so we have two speakers today, and I'd like to introduce our first one, and this is Maria Duggan, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow, and she's based in University of Newcastle, and her area of expertise is Roman and Byzantine ceramics, and she's done a lot of work on trade and economy, and particularly has done a bunch of work at Tintagel. And today she's going to be, the title of the presentation is talking about looking beyond the sherds, data definitions and distributions of imported pottery. So this is obviously a topic Ewan has done lots of work on. So it's fantastic to see a kind of, feel like, another generation coming through also embracing this topic. So I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to say, Maria, could you please share your screen and take us away? Thank you.
Can you see that screen? Is that showing okay?
It's looking great. Not as blue as Iona, I have to say.
Oh, sorry. That was a slightly cloudy day, I think, that time. Okay. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. It is a real honor to be asked to participate in this series, particularly when, you know, it's in honor of someone whose work you've been reading incessantly for the last 8 years or so. Obviously, this topic of the imported wares is a big subject, and there's only so much that I'm going to be able to get across in the next 25 minutes or so. So my plan was kind of to introduce the material a little bit. You might be familiar with it. Some of you will be very familiar with it, some maybe less so. So it's worth just going over some of the main types. And then I want to try and discuss some of the trajectories in research, particularly some sort of more recent developments. And what I want to try and bring out is how some of the approaches taken by the researchers have sort of developed the interpretations of this material, and particularly, I think, decisions and approaches taken by Ewan in his research. And I want to take this opportunity at the start to say that although I haven't been lucky enough to work with Ewan personally, we've been in contact for a few years, and he's always been so extremely supportive of my research, and I'm really grateful for his help throughout my PhD and as that work continues. Okay. So you should be looking at some pots if that's working okay. So just to start introducing you to the material, in terms of these imported wares, we're looking at Mediterranean ceramics and also ceramics from the continent. In terms of Mediterranean material, we have fine ware. First of all, this late Roman sea or Phocaean red slip fine ware coming from Western Turkey. And the material that we have in Britain is all pretty much of the same form. So it's fairly big dishes of this haze form 3. And it's the kind of variants of this particular form that have founded the dating system for the Mediterranean imports as a whole, and have been really crucial for that. And because we have dates for these in the East Mediterranean in places like the Athenian Agora, we can date deposits in Britain potentially that have these same ceramics. In slightly lower numbers, we have African red slip ceramics, which again are fine slipped table dishes, and we have a kind of suite of forms that are coming from North Africa of about the same date. So these are all roughly contemporary in the later 5th towards the mid 6th century, with a little bit of movement on either side of that. But more common than the fine wares, we have amphorae, which of course are large vessels for transport and storage of liquid commodities, things like wine and oil. And by these late Roman period, we have this quite well established package of amphorae of quite distinguishable types, which John Riley classified from places like Carthage and Benghazi. So we have this late Roman amphora series. And what we have in Britain is particularly this late Roman 1 and late Roman 2 up in the top left corner. But these are quite long-lived types, so the instances are mostly dated in relation to the fine ware. But because we've had this long history of research in Britain, we also have this B-ware classification sequence. So a lot of the earlier publications will refer to this, and annoyingly, B1 doesn't equal late Roman 1, it's the opposite way around. And then the sort of hangover of that B-ware sequence is this B5 amphora, which is a sort of third or fourth less common amphora coming up from Britain, which has previously been assigned a North African origin, but that's increasingly being questioned, and that's something that I've been trying to get to grips with a little bit. So we'll have some more discussion about that slightly later on. And then we have this subsequent phase, which Ewan, among others, has described as being this continental phase of imports. Seemingly transitionary between the two are fine wares coming from the Bordeaux region, this DSPA or D-ware, which is very similar table dishes, but in a grey fabric instead of red. And then this E-ware, which many of you will be very familiar with, which is a common or coarse ware. And we now again think that this is probably coming from the Aquitaine region, potentially a region around Bordeaux. And connected with this is also the imported glasswares, which are an important item moving through these Atlantic systems. But I'm not going to say very much about the E-ware or the glass, principally because I'm not dealing with either in terms of my research at the minute. But of course, Ewan's work has been really crucial in terms of understanding these particular categories. So for the E-ware, in terms of developing the form series, understanding things like the contents and function of the E-ware, and expanding the distribution of this. And for the glass in particular, I think we mentioned at the previous talk, showing that this material was arriving at sites in the West as vessels, was actually imported as glass vessels into the West, and not just as colour for reuse. So they're things that Ewan's talked about in his publications. So these wares have been studied in Britain for a really long time, right back to the 1930s when Raleigh Radford was digging at Tintagel. And this is where this sort of alphabetical sequence developed, which was refined by Charles Thomas, who subdivided these B wares and introduced this idea of E wares. As I mentioned, that link with being able to date these finds through connections with Mediterranean assemblages really starts to come through from John Hayes' catalogue of late Roman pottery in the Mediterranean, which allows us to draw these comparisons. Charles Thomas in 1981 did a big catalogue of all these types from Britain and Ireland. And then from the 80s, we get Ewan starting to publish reports and publications on these types and their interpretations. And in 1991, he published his, finished his thesis, Imported Goods in the Early Medieval Celtic West with special reference to Dinas Powys. And in 2007, published this as a monograph with all kinds of updated information on these finds, together with a really comprehensive online catalogue of these insular imports. And it was also in 2007 that the publication of the University of Glasgow excavations at Tintagel came out, where Ewan had published the glass material coming from that dig, with the ceramic analysis by Carl Thorpe. And also I should mention, around the same time, starting to get much more information out from Ireland with publications from Ian Doyle and Amanda Kelly. But it's Ewan's monograph here from 2007, which is really the sort of benchmark for understandings of these imported wares in Britain and Ireland. As I say, with this really comprehensive catalogue of finds from Britain. And this is a map taken from Ewan's data that was lodged on the Archaeological Data Service, and you can see the focus of distribution of amphorae here on southwest Britain. And that very big splodge is Tintagel. So Ewan was looking at all this material and working out the quantities from all of these different sites, allowing these kind of distributions to be plotted. And this, across this work, Ewan developed a model of really sustained, long-lasting exchange with Britain, founded on the mineral resources of the southwest, principally for this Mediterranean phase, and associated this with contemporary demand for metals, particularly tin in the East Mediterranean. So we've got this two-way system of metals, particularly going from southwest Britain towards the East Mediterranean, with things like oil, wine, or other luxury commodities heading towards northwest Europe. My own PhD research was not to sort of look at all the insular finds again. There was no need. Everything was very well understood from the back of that. But to look at the insular finds within a sort of wider Atlantic seaboard system, and specifically to look at questions of transportation of these finds from the East Med to Britain. And across the history of research, we have this idea that developed of direct connection with the East Mediterranean, that finds or material, amphorae and things were coming from the East Mediterranean and being transported directly to southwest Britain. And this really comes from a sort of two main aspects. Firstly, that there didn't really seem to be very many finds of the same types along the Atlantic coast. There's a sort of scarcity of parallel finds in that region. And secondly, that there was something different about the Atlantic finds that set them apart from typical distribution patterns in the West Mediterranean. So the typical suite of material that we see of East Mediterranean finds in the West Mediterranean doesn't really marry up well with what was appearing in places like southwest Britain. So I won't go through all these types, but Mike Fulford focused on this unusually high percentage of East Mediterranean finds to, say, North African amphorae, and Ewan defined this list of peculiar characteristics of the British material that set it apart. And this maybe meant that there was something unusual about the systems that brought this material to Britain, and that there needed to be a sort of different interpretation from why and how these arrived. And this idea of a lack of parallel material in the Atlantic, we can take back to Bernard Wales, who did a thesis in the early 60s, looking for parallel examples from Spain and Portugal, based principally in this instance on suggestions that Raleigh Radford had made for parallel finds, and He wasn't wrong, he discounted these finds, but unfortunately this idea that there wasn't much of parallel or equivalent material from the Atlantic kind of persisted from that point onwards. But I was lucky that as I was starting my PhD, an awful lot of information had started to come out from the Atlantic, showing that sites in northwest Spain, Western France and Portugal had actually a lot of the same types of amphorae and finewares. In this case, looking specifically at the late Roman sea fineware from Western Turkey, we can really see that the distribution shows that Britain wasn't the focus for the transportation of these finds into the Atlantic, and instead really seems to be at the northern end of a much wider Atlantic distribution. So you can see the distribution of this fineware right the way up the Portuguese coast, with that very large splodge being the site of Vigo in Galicia. So just to sum up some of the conclusions that were coming from that work, and I should of course state that all of those ideas are coming from discussions with people working in Britain and across the Atlantic, that Britain and Ireland, rather than having this kind of exceptional distribution of finds of this period, instead seems to be at the northern reaches of a major expansion of East Mediterranean trade into the Atlantic from about 450, 475 towards the mid-6th century. And in 2014, a colleague of mine, Adolfo Fernandez, published his assemblage of material from Vigo, which is really on a massive scale and very much dwarfs the insular quantities of material. And he's interpreted the site as being an emporium that operated as the primary Atlantic transshipment point. And in fact, the dates of that material really push that system into the 7th century. He's got later finds than we have in Britain, and as I said, in much larger quantities. So although that system kind of persists, what we see is that the Mediterranean imports being transshipped on towards Britain seem to be in decline from the mid-6th century. So we can discount that idea that the insular distribution was isolated, and for me, that suggests that the transportation model should be seen as being staged or indirect in terms of links with the East Mediterranean. But what we can see is that the British assemblage does seem to be distinct from patterns in the West Mediterranean. So those characteristics that Ewan had picked out certainly hold true, but instead of being something that's peculiar to Britain, it actually seems to be something that's different about the Atlantic system around this date. And it's particularly tied to this chronological period between the later 5th and first half of the 6th century. Just some other ideas, things that I was suggesting, that exchange in Atlantic Spain and Portugal is characterized by demand for tablewares. These seem much more common in that area, and it's possible that these were transported with grain, so there might be a link there, but that amphoras on a whole seem to be more common, relatively more common further north. So maybe that distribution further north is driven by wine. But of course, the ceramics only represent one aspect, the surviving aspect of probably a much bigger system of transportation of luxuries. And this continental phase with e-ware seems to be the evolution of the same system into the 6th and 7th century. So because we now think that e-ware is probably coming from the Bordeaux area or general area, we can suggest that there's a shift towards Bordeaux in these systems into the slightly later period. And interestingly, Adolfo's work in Galicia has shown that e-ware and the DSPA fineware were both being transported south. So we've got material moving south as well as further north into Britain and Ireland in this slightly later phase. So this is me just attempting to give an overview of these Atlantic systems of transshipment. You can see Vigo there in Galicia operating as the primary arrival point for East Mediterranean material in the Atlantic, with this kind of staged transmission further north to Britain and Ireland. And during my PhD, we held this symposium at Newcastle, looking at this question of Atlantic connections based on the ceramics. And we had speakers there from Portugal and Spain and France, as well as Britain and Ireland. And we were very glad that Ewan was there to open the day with his talk. And in his talk and in the published proceedings, which came out this year, Ewan set out some future directions for the research on this material in Britain, and also sort of outlined some of the key approaches that he'd taken in his research on the imported wares. And I thought it might be nice to just talk about these and what I've sort of learned from these approaches and how I've tried to incorporate them into my research as it goes on. So in terms of future directions, suggestions for research, some wider comparisons of the insular and Atlantic groups, a detailed study of the Tintagel assemblage, something that's kind of the holy grail. It's the looking for the e-ware production site.
Oh.
And also looking for trying to find new types of analysis and to use these to look at this material. So techniques like network analysis, as well as scientific techniques looking at provenance and content. So that's the suggestions. And in terms of approaches to the material, Ewan highlights his geological background. And that's something that I think that's really important for looking at this material. So when I was getting my new project together, I thought it was quite important that I learnt those skills of petrology, and I'll come on to that. Something that seems like a minor thing, but I think is really important in terms of the material is Ewan talks about this focus on individual vessels as being the foundation for the data, and on vessel counts. So at a site level, something that he did looking at places like Dinas Powys is looking at taphonomic studies and how you can connect sherds to vessels and look at how they move around on site, but also looking at vessels as a method for making comparisons between sites, both within Britain and a kind of at that bigger scale. So sherd counts, of course, you can have 100 sherds from the same vessel, but once you start talking about vessels, it allows you to kind of construct these narratives between different regions. Of course, the importance of glass, and I'm not going to say too much about that. And something that he doesn't mention specifically, but I think is a really big change was that adoption by Ewan of that late Roman amphora sequence, which is the sort of the accepted terminology in the Mediterranean. But of course, if you're not using that terminology, it's very difficult to just to publish or to talk to people in Mediterranean research about what they're finding. It's the perennial problem with ceramic research is we can have huge amounts of names for the same thing, but unless we start to talk the same language, things get very difficult. Okay, so one of those recommendations was, of course, to look at Tintagel. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the site now in relation to my current project. So here's the headland, and it's just missing that picture of the new bridge that arrived at this site. And Tintagel has really by some margin the largest quantity of these imported wares in Britain. I think there's only really the site at Bantham in South Devon, which has a number of vessels that's kind of approaching the same sort of scale. So it's not really on a Mediterranean scale in terms of the assemblage. We're talking about a few hundred vessels perhaps, but that's really on a very large scale for Britain. And the majority of material is held at the Royal Cornwall Museum, but here's a slide just showing some finds from the English Heritage Visitor Centre, just to give you an impression of the types of material from here. So you can see down in the bottom right, that combed late Roman II amphorae. Probably now we think coming mostly from the Peloponnese, plus some fine wares and then fragments of glass as well down in the bottom left. And the material in the Royal Cornwall Museum has been collected there for nearly 100 years. There have been finds turning up for a long time, right back to 1918. The majority of them were recovered during Raleigh Radford's excavations at the site from the 1930s. And these were sorted and boxed and gone through and looked at and published on quite considerably by Charles Thomas in the decades from the 1950s, latterly together with Carl Thorpe. So a lot of the material has been sorted into these broad types that we've developed from this sort of alphabetical sequence at the site. So one of the first tasks for me was to look at this material in the museum and try to understand this long history of work that had gone on with it. There's been lots of phases of work at the site, and I should mention excavations on the mainland side of the site in the early 90s, co-directed by Charles Thomas and Jackie Nowakowski, and also the University of Glasgow excavations in the 1990s, which were published in 2007, looking principally at areas that Raleigh Radford had looked at before. There was a fire in the site in the 80s, which led to a survey of earthworks which were interpreted to be buildings, and this showed that there was buildings pretty much right the way across the headland, and from almost across this entire area, sherds of imported ceramics have turned up. In 2016, or just before, a new phase of work was started, looking at previously unexcavated earthworks on the South Terrace, principally to try and understand what these buildings were about on the site. But of course, this turned up a lot of imported material. And very happily, I was asked to be the ceramic specialist for the imported wares. So I'm going to say a little bit about those finds from that excavation. So evaluation trenches were opened in 2016 with a larger excavation directed by Jackie Nowakowski for English Heritage and Cornwall Archaeology Unit on the South Terrace, which revealed these very large stone-built buildings. But it was clear from analysis at the site and looking at the site that the walls were actually, or the southernmost walls were built on top of midden deposits. And it's from these midden deposits that a lot of imported ceramics were turning up. So just to show you some of the finds that I've been lucky enough to be having a look at, these are all sherds from 2017. So it's about 70%, I'd say, of the total, all from this 1 year's excavation, which is really a lot of material from one of the British sites. So on the back table are all amphora sherds, pretty much, and from the front table are all these East Mediterranean fine wares with just a few Bordeaux region fine wares. So all that analysis is still ongoing, but I can give you a few indications of how that's developing and some information that's coming out from that. It was just over 2,000 sherds from the 2 years of excavation, of which about 77 diagnostic finds. And I've, of course, been trying to get this down towards individual vessels, which I think somewhere around at the minute 40 or so vessels, dominated by amphora, of course, and of these late Roman I and late Roman II amphorae are the most common. But I think very high fineware quantities for Britain, and the amount of fineware that's turning up from the site really is quite unusual now. And for me, I'll move on to this, but just to, I think that there's evidence there that there's a real demand for fineware for dining that seems to be coming through from the site. So the graphs that I've got here show you the importance of late Roman I and late Roman II amphorae, as well as other finds. But of course, at present, these are by sherd count and weight, but I hope to give more detailed data. But also coming through from this excavation, sherds that don't necessarily fit into this standard package of material that's been published for a long time for Britain, perhaps new types of material that are suggesting new sources for ceramics arriving in Britain. Just to show you, here's a couple of the fineware forms. Again, this is this Hayes Late Roman C Form 3. 14 vessels of this, 18 sherds, but representing 4 vessels from the 2 years of excavation. This is a really beautiful rim sherd. And as I've mentioned, the quantities of fineware that seem to be appearing from Tintagel are quite unusual in a British context, I think. Amphora sherds, so our typical late Roman 1 and late Roman 2, coming from the Peloponnese area and southern Turkey with the late Roman 1. And then smaller quantities of the Ephesus region, late Roman 3, you can see on the right. But also less typical types of material that have been trickier to try and get a handle on. Sherds of maybe different types of amphora, possibly of Mediterranean or even Atlantic origin. And the very small thing in the bottom left is a handle of a juglet, possibly coming from the Antioch region. And the beauty of having that Vigo assemblage now is that that's almost a reference collection to look at possibilities for more unusual items coming from British contexts. Adolfo's work there in Galicia. And it was actually Adolfo that suggested to me that this rim sherd on the right here belonged to an amphora type called Agora M273, which is coming from the Athenian Agora. And this is something that we haven't seen from Britain before. And I'll come on to this just a little bit more. So in terms of my actual postdoc, the aims are to do a full quantification of the Tintagel material, investigating known types, looking at variability in terms of well-known and established types, but also to look at new types. And the kind of key to this project is this collaboration with the British School at Athens, which is allowing petrographic and chemical analysis of 103 samples from Tintagel, using the Fitch Lab collections as a reference to explore provenance and to characterize the material. So we have taken samples from all different periods of work at Tintagel and covering all the different types of ceramics with the aims of understanding the use and significance of these imported wares at Tintagel. So just to show you in terms of amphoras, looking at things like the variability within these more well-known groups, but also looking at this material that perhaps isn't quite as well understood, unidentified material. And we've got this question of B5 amphora, which I'll just mention very quickly. So obviously there's not time to talk in great depth about the scientific analysis that I'm doing in collaboration with Dr. Evangelia Kyriazzi and Noemi Muller at the Fitch Laboratory, but just to give you some initial bit of an overview, some pictures and some ideas. The late Roman 1 amphora and the late Roman 2, we're seeing a similar kind of story. Most of the material is fitting within quite similar categories of material, just with a few outliers. So we can start to say that the material that's arriving in Britain is fairly coherent, but isn't necessarily all representing the same source. This question of B5 amphorae that I mentioned at the start, historically these have been linked to North Africa, but several people have suggested that alternative sources are more likely, and Paul Reynolds working in Spain, looking at the finds from Bantam and Tintagel, suggested a southern Spanish origin might be more likely. And fairly recently, they've started to publish amphorae from Huelva in the south of Spain, and we know now that they're producing amphora into the first half of the 6th century. My friend Adolfo suggested to me that he has these Huelva amphorae at Vigo, and it might be that this is what we're seeing at Tintagel. So this would be completely new, having amphorae of Spanish origin in post-Roman Britain. So this is obviously quite exciting, and we did a presentation on this not so long ago, which is in the process of being published. But the actual North African amphorae seem to be pretty scarce when we've had a look. We took a few samples of material, but it seems that of that B5 group, very little of it really was of African origin. But when we've looked at the B5 group in terms of petrology, although we can say in terms of the morphology, we can perhaps connect this to southern Spain. Actually, there's quite a bit of variability within that group as well. So there's obviously more questions to ask about where that's coming from. Maybe it's representing a variety of sources of Mediterranean, or possibly various sources within southern Spain or Portugal. Then we have this other group of material that we kind of picked out. I mentioned that agora and 273 amphora. And off the basis of that, we picked out, myself and Dr. Kyriatsi, sherds of amphorae that are different from what we've been seeing in Britain previously, this red micaceous working group. So it's about half a dozen amphorae. And when we've looked at the petrology on this, it has this very interesting volcanic inclusions. So although we can connect it to this type, the fabric itself is a bit unusual for this. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a sort of quite a complexity in Aegean amphora of this period. And it's not a straightforward task of matching the British finds up to very well understood Mediterranean assemblages. There's a sort of dialogue that needs to go on between these two areas. Here's just, I won't go through these, but just some provisional thoughts about the scientific analysis that's going on. Main thing to get across is that the British material does seem to be more diverse than previously thought, having some unusual types and representing new sources, so material coming from southern Spain and potentially from islands in the Aegean. So I've mentioned on the right, Huelva region amphora. This is a Laodan type, very large amphora type, and I think we're starting to suggest now that this B5 group of material certainly includes amphorae of this type. But that we also have this family of late Roman 8, potentially Samos region or eastern southern Aegean island amphorae. So that's hopefully something that we can develop. And picking out these kind of more unusual amphorae, we can start to link the types to other sites across the Mediterranean. So Paul Reynolds has been publishing amphorae of this kind of broad type from Butrint, and looking at some of the petrological work that Leandro Fantuzzi's done here, I think there's parallels to be drawn there in terms of the petrology. And here's some similar amphorae, potentially in the Cryptobalbi in Rome. So all of this analysis is ongoing, but I think we can start to draw new types of material that are suggesting new connections. So here's just an overview of sources for the material that's turning up in Tintagel, and which can be applied to Britain and Ireland, Western Britain more generally. And then the task beyond that is to try and match up those sources to the wider systems of maritime exchange in late antiquity. So I'll leave it there, and I hope that explains some of the current thinking that I have and work that's going on in terms of this material. But of course, this work is a continuum right back from Raleigh Radford's early work. So I'm extremely grateful for everyone who's published on this material before that I'm able to take this discussion onwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Maria. That was really fascinating to see how that's moved on, and an awful lot of science being thrown at what had been a kind of I don't know. One always worried about the integrity of some of these letter classifications, and this really seems to have pushed it on. I'd rather, and we don't have, in order to keep a bit to time, I would kind of like to hold off on any questions for the minute. I have a couple, but I think we need to move on. And I believe we've got a bit of a halftime show before we kick off with our next paper. And so Adrian, I don't know if you would be able to share your screen.
I think maybe it's best to move on to Andy so that he has enough time, and then maybe we'll throw some time for tribute at the end. I know we've got people in the audience who want to say a word or two, but I think maybe best to throw it over to Andy at this point.
Okay, right. Well, let's do that. So Andy Seaman is working at Christ Church Canterbury, and he's for the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, he's been working really primarily on Welsh material, but expanding out of that. And he's particularly looking at Hillforts and social change, and he's done some really interesting stuff around Dinas Powys, rethinking that. And more widely, he's got an important paper on the multiple estate concept as well. And rather than say any more now, Andy, perhaps you could tell us your thoughts about Hillforts and social change in Western Britain from AD 300 to 700. So,
okay. Can you hear me, and can you see the screen?
You can see your screen. And we can hear you. And so
excellent.
Mute your mics, everyone, but Andy.
Okay, great. Okay, well, first of all, just like to thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this series. It really is a privilege. When I started my PhD, the first task that Alan Lane set for me was to go and read Ewan's thesis. And I can remember thinking to myself, oh my word, what a piece of scholarship. How am I ever going to produce something like that? Now, I'd just like to start this talk by returning to a theme which Nancy Edwards drew out of the last session, which was Ewan's contributions to Welsh archaeology, which are many and varied. The Edwards and Lane Early Medieval Settlements in Wales volume, Ewan contributed significantly to that, and over 30 years on, that sort of remains still one of the main sort of books on the topic. And Nancy mentioned Ewan's excavations at Longby Bank, but another one of these sort of really important reports, and a site which Ewan was writing up in collaboration with Philip MacDonald, was the Coent Eastgate Cemetery, which is published in Archaeologia Cambriensis, and this is a really important site. It's a post-Roman cemetery outside of a Roman town, and it poses lots of really interesting questions about the status of that town in the post-Roman centuries. But of course, it wasn't just post-Roman archaeology which Ewan was working on. There's a 100-page review of later medieval pottery and tile. I couldn't get a PDF of that, but I could get a PDF of the a review of post-Roman, post-medieval material as well. So there's a huge body of work. And obviously that's not just in Wales. Ewan's contributions to the sort of wider Brittonic-speaking West, very significant as well. Some really important work on the Tintagel ceramics, which Maria has just been considering, and also important contributions to the Cadbury Castle excavations. There was, I'm sure everyone's aware, there was some debate over the reality or not of the Dark Age Hall, which Alcock had excavated, and Ewan's work on the very fine analysis of the ceramics and the taphonomy suggested that hall is real. And I think it's fair to say that if it was Radford and Thomas who put these sites on the radar, and then Alcock and Philip Raats and others such as Ian Burrow, who did some important work in the 70s, kind of defining Hillforts as an important site type. It's really Ewan's work in the 80s and 90s and subsequently which have really helped us to understand what these places are and how they functioned, and the importance of trade and exchange, and the place of these sites in patterns of power. And I think that's a really important contribution. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of following up some of Ewan's work and some of his ideas on the southern British material. And what I'd like to start with is Dinas Powys. So excavated in the 1950s, research and training excavation by Leslie Alcock, and it was then and remains now the richest post-Roman assemblage from Wales. We've got lots of imports, including a famous vessel with the bunnies on it. We've got glass, Atlantic tradition glass, and also Germanic glass, big metalwork assemblage and metalworking assemblage. And it is a very monumental site, multi-valet defences, 4 sets of ditches and banks, 3 of which are very big. So it's a very important site, but was not classified as a hill fort by Alcock. If you read his excavation report, what Dinas Powys was a fairly small enclosed settlement, enclosed by a single bank and ditch, not a very big bank and ditch at that, which had a castle constructed on top of it in the 11th century, a multi-valet ringwork castle, which had sort of subsumed the earlier but very rich post-Roman 5th to 7th century settlement. And what Ewan did in his PhD was to really question the validity of Alcock's interpretations, and return to the site and undertake very, very detailed work on the stratigraphy and on the ceramics and the sort of taphonomy and the distribution of material. And I think it's testament to sort of the quality of Alcock's excavations, the amount of work Ewan was able to do. And it really is a very impressive piece of research. And one of the sort of biggest sort of takeaway points was that Ewan was able to demonstrate that there was a differentiation in the ceramics found below the biggest bank, Bank 1, and those found stratified against the back of it. So the Mediterranean imports, the amphora and the red slipwares, were stratified below the bank, and the continental imports were stratified above or against the back of this large bank. So Ewan suggested that the multi-valet Norman ringwork was actually not a Norman castle, but it's a post-Roman. All the banks and ditches are post-Roman. So rather than Dinas Powys being a fairly sort of weakly defended high status settlement, at least in its early phases, certainly in its later phases in the 7th century, it's a very substantial multi-valet monumental site, which is being fortified repeatedly, and probably not purely for functional purposes. Ewan was also able to do some really interesting work looking at the distributions of material and starting to be able to reconstruct how the site was being used and different sorts of activity areas. So one thing I've been working on since my PhD has really been taking Ewan's work as a basis to do some further analysis. So one thing we've been doing is some radiocarbon dating, and here I should acknowledge the support of Gordon Noble and Comparative Kingship Project, which has helped with getting these dates. So what we've been doing is radiocarbon dating material from Alcock's archive. He didn't keep charcoal from all deposits, but he kept charcoal from a lot of deposits. And we've been able to get that ID'd and get some short life dates dated. And what these dates show is, well, first of all, they conclusively prove that there is no Norman ringwork here. Ewan was absolutely right. Dinas Powys is post-Roman. We've got dates on the latest stratigraphic layers, and they're returning 6th, 7th century. So there's no Norman activity here. But they also show some other interesting things. I had hoped to be able to do some Bayesian modelling on the dates from above and below the Rampart sequences and try to refine the sequence. But it's clear that we've got both residuality and sort of mixing and intrusive material getting into lower deposits. It's a very wooded site. There's a lot of tree growth, animal burrowing as well. But when you take the dates as a whole, they're quite interesting. And they really are quite narrow. We've got one or two which stretch back into the 5th century, but they very much focus on the later 6th, early 7th century. And it's important to say we've got dates here from very early stratigraphic layers and dates here from later layers. And if you do sort of model the dates as a whole, you're looking at sort of site starting in the late 5th, early 6th century and falling out of use in the sort of mid to late or early to mid 7th century. And that ties in very well with the lack of Roman material from the site. So it's perhaps only in use for 100 years or more. And it's interesting that we've got both the continental and the Mediterranean imports, which may tell us something about the sort of time span that they are in use for. Now, kind of zooming out from Dinas Powys, another thing I've been trying to do is to get a handle on this the sort of chronology of the wider Hillfort phenomena in southern Britain. And I've been able to pull together about 50, 60 dates from various Hillforts and defended settlements. And generally they're saying, giving us a similar picture to what we've got at Dinas Powys. And again, we've got dates here from relatively early and relatively late within the sequences at these sites. There are a few dates which stray beyond 700 and stray into the 8th century, but the vast majority are sort of coming to the end in the 7th, but not really that close to 700. Now, the earlier part of the distribution is probably a bit underrepresented. We haven't got that many dates from sites which throw up Roman material. So this early part of the graph here is probably should be rising more like that. But we do have this, what appears to be quite a sudden drop off in Hillfort activity in the 7th century. Now, whether this means Hillforts are abandoned perhaps needs some consideration. We do have a couple of dates which are later. We do have some sites which produce later materials. So Britton Ferry, Hengaskell, near Neath, a site where Ewan contributed to the reports, that has good sort of Viking Age material. Duggan Castle here, small excavations by Alcock in the 60s. That is supposedly referred to in as being destroyed in the 9th century by lightning. And there's another poem which also probably refers to Hillfort, to a Hillfort in the potentially in the 9th century. So whether these sites are entirely abandoned or we see a change in the nature of activity, there is certainly something very big happening. One of the only real exceptions to this isn't the Hillfort at all. It's Llanbed Goch, which is a defended enclosure in Anglesey, a low-lying site. And this is a sequence of dates going from the 6th century all the way through to the Viking Age. And it looks like we've got continuous activity. And it may be significant that Llanbed Goch is a low-lying site and therefore retains some sort of significance. Another thing we're getting more evidence of is Hillforts without import ware. For a long time, well, even now, our only diagnostic evidence to identify post-Roman sites, unless we're lucky enough to find a bit of metalwork, is the imported pottery. But as we know, the imports are patchy in their distribution, and they're not getting to all parts of Western Britain. But thankfully, through programs of developer-funded excavation, and particularly the use of radiocarbon dating, we're also starting now to fill in some of our gaps in the distribution of hillforts and defended settlements. So there's Glanfred in Ceredigion, a site which isn't too dissimilar to Dinas Powys, a sort of promontory fort by Vallet. And in Devon Radden, we've got a hill fort on this ridge here, quite high up. And quite recently, there's been some post-Roman dates, 2 post-Roman dates published from Badbury Rings in Dorset. Now this is quite interesting. Badbury is a very, very big hill fort. The majority of our post-Roman sites are 0.1 to 2 hectares in area, with some exceptionally large ones like Tintagel and South Cadbury. And if the dates from Badbury are indicative of reoccupation, then it's reoccupation of, and if that's telling us that the wider site is reoccupied or potentially even refortified, then that's quite exciting. It could be quite a major site. And I won't mention anything about Badbury potentially being Mount Badden and Gildas. I'll leave that to one side. So returning to Dinas Powys, one of the interesting questions which was thrown up by Ewan's redating and our confirmation of that surrounds what Alcock called the southern banks. And these are a curious set of earthworks to the south of the hill fort, about 140 meters to the south, which were trenched by Alcock. Geoffrey Wainwright supervised the excavation. A single long trench through both banks. Not very much material was excavated, but Alcock suggested that this first bank, Bank A, was an incomplete prehistoric enclosure, and that Bank B here, this L-shaped one, was a siege work, a Norman siege work, and part of his narrative of the site, the main hill fort being a Welsh castle. So obviously Ewan's redating and the radiocarbon dating casts this into some doubt. We won't. Southern Bank B is not going to be a Norman siege work if the hill fort isn't a Norman castle. So Alan Lane and I started a program of survey and excavation in around 2011, running through to 2014, which the aim was really to try to establish what these earthworks are and how they relate to the hill fort. And it wasn't an easy task, as you can see from this photograph. The earthworks are now very wooded, and there's been a lot of bioturbation. The sites are scheduled ancient monuments, but also parts are also sites of special scientific interest. I'm sure you'll also remember that 2012 was a slightly wet year, and of the 28 days we were on site, it rained 26. So it was a little tough conditions for excavation. But what we were able to do is fairly conclusively date these earthworks. So Southern Bank B here, we had an almost complete Glastonbury ware, late Iron Age Glastonbury ware bowl from the base of the ditch of this bank, which had been, and that was covered by rampart collapse. And on top of that rampart collapse, we got some sherds of Samian. So we were we can be fairly certain that Southern Bank B is a late prehistoric, late Iron Age, perhaps into very early Roman enclosure. And if you look hard enough, you can find examples of these L-shaped incomplete enclosures. We've done geophysics and trial trenching out beyond to see if we could find any completion to the earthwork, but it's not there. Southern Bank A was a bit more interesting though. This is a straight linear earthwork. It starts very big, quite monumental, and fades down into only half a metre high. You've then got a little supposed entrance and another short section of bank. We opened one trench across this earthwork, and we were able to see quite clearly its sequence of construction. And we got a couple of dates from the ditch, from the primary silting of the ditch, two of which were early medieval. One was 6th going into 7th century, and one was 7th going into 8th century. Unfortunately, they don't overlap. They were on short life samples, but they were they could have been washed in at a later date. The earthwork had clearly collapsed very shortly after the ditch had been dug. There was not very much in the way of primary fill, and then the rampart had collapsed in. There was no recutting. So it's a curious thing. It does seem to be incomplete, and it is probably significant that the dates we're getting from Bank A are right at the end of the Hillfort sequence, if not a little later. So it could be that this is a project that was started, perhaps some refortification or re-enclosure of Bank B, and that it was abandoned before it was completed, perhaps when the Hillfort itself was abandoned. I tried to convince Alan that maybe it was some sort of monumental entrance into the Hillfort, but I think that's perhaps wishful thinking. Some further work we've been doing is trying to put Dinas Powys in its landscape context, and that's not such an easy task because the landscape around the site is now heavily wooded. It's a devil to photograph the site, and it's a devil to get any very difficult to get any sense of how it's sat within its landscape. So a little project which I instigated with a colleague of mine, Leo Sukarina Thomas, was to try to apply some GIS techniques to get a better understanding of how this site sat within its landscape. And that wasn't an easy task in itself because the landscape has been quite heavily altered through development and road building. But what we did was apply least cost path analysis and visual prominence, so viewshed analysis and cumulative viewshed analysis, which we think demonstrated that the site's actually situated in quite a particular location, sitting on the head of the confluence of routeways leading from landing places on the coast, perhaps where these imports are arriving, and that the site was able to sort of dominate or visually dominate those routeways and would have been a very conspicuous landmark in its location. And that was published in the European Journal of Archaeology earlier this year. Now, just moving away from Dinas Powys, and the final sort of couple of slides, I'd just like to draw attention to a really interesting article by Ewan a couple of years, a decade ago now, the archaeology of writing in the time of Adaman of Iona. And it's a fascinating short piece where Ewan explores evidence for literacy and writing amongst the secular elite. And if we sort of take that theme and apply it to southern Britain, there's certainly no shortage of secular literacy in the post-Roman centuries. We've got 250 Latin and/or Ogham inscribed memorial stones, and they've been put very convincingly within a secular context. We've got inscriptions from secular sites. So 2 inscriptions now from Tintagel. The late Roman inscription isn't so convincing, but the famous Artognu stone here, we've got quite convincing informal inscriptions of 6th, probably 7th century date. And of course, Gildas tells us that leaders at this time are likely to have been literate. So Magna Cunus, the dragon of the island, probably a king of Gwynedd in the 6th century. And Gildas tells us that he had been a monk for a while, who had been instructed by the most accomplished teacher of the whole of Britain. So it's interesting, I think, that we find evidence for potential literacy at a number of Hillfort sites in the south. And I've been going through a lot of these reports recently, and consistently coming up are style, so writing implements, writing on wax tablets. We've got these from a number of sites. There's 2 or 3 from new pieces, where Glasgow, I think, did some work in the 1990s, but the style come from earlier excavations. Coigan Camp, Canterbury Congresbury, Dinorban, potentially one from Dinas Powys, but it's perhaps a little less convincing. And I've just included Moat of Mark here as well, strayed north of the wall, but I think that's potentially important. Now, usually where these finds have been noted, they've been placed within a late Roman context, suggested that these are, these are finds, residual finds, or many of these sites do have Roman occupation. But I think it's interesting, given the evidence for secular lay literacy in the post-Roman centuries, I think it's entirely feasible that some of these style were in use in the post-Roman centuries as well, and that these sites, these defended settlements, aren't just the strongholds of warlords or sort of functional defended sites. These are centres of power and authority, where some interesting things are happening. And I would flag up, most of Mark looks to be purely post-Roman. Dinas Powys doesn't have a Roman phase to it. So these, I think those examples are very likely to be post-Roman. Okay, I think I've used up my 25 minutes, so I shall leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that that roundup and that kind of nice kind of setting in context some of the information about where some of this pottery that Maria was talking about. Now, as I say, we're hoping to allow for some questions. It'd be maybe handy to, because there's so many of you, to kind of bash stuff into the chat function so we can pick that up and try to structure this. And I don't, so the question I had, and maybe we can just start with this, and this is for Maria, and the question, sorry, I'll reveal myself again. The question I had was, given all the new scientific work on the different vessel forms and the petrology of these vessels, is it likely that it'll be possible to visually recognize some of these differences in pottery type without having to recourse to petrology? I mean, are we coming up with now a kind of clear understanding of what these things look like, so that we might actually be able to recognize them without the science?
Yes and no, I think. Hopefully, once we start to pick out some of these more unusual types, and I should stress that the bulk of the material fits pretty well into quite well established types like late Roman 1, late Roman 2. We can pick those out fairly clearly. It's this kind of subset of slightly more unusual things. So hopefully there's elements that can pick out, but it's quite difficult. And I think there has been this expectation a little bit of the British finds that they're all identifiable, which is something that, working in the East Mediterranean, just the volume of material you possibly wouldn't have the same expectations of. I think there's finds in there that just look unusual, and I think it's going to be difficult to pick out some of the body sherds that look a bit unusual. And I noticed as well that a couple of the things look really quite different once you actually get them in the thin section. So in terms of identifying broad types, yeah, I think that's going to be possible. But in terms of identifying source locations from sherds, I think that's going to be maybe a bit more tricky.
Can I just add that the conditions that you find the pottery in Western Britain, very acid soils, also changes the sherds very much, and they can look entirely different, particularly the deware and some of the other stuff. And often they've been burnt or deposited in middens with a lot of other material which has blackened them and so on. It can be really quite confusing.
Just to say, Ewan, you're exactly right with that. I had a sherd from Tintagel that I thought, looking at it, looked like Eastern Mediterranean cooking ware, and that was the kind of interpretation. But in thin section, it was clear that it's a burned piece of amphora. So I think you're right, things look very different under the microscope, maybe, because of these changes.
Okay, can I direct a question towards Andy? I don't know if you've seen it in the chat, but it's the question is from Adrian. It's, how early do the ramparts at Llanvedra go? And I'm sure that's not how it's pronounced. And are there other examples of low-lying enclosures that are comparable? Maybe quite a big question, but yeah,
it's not yet fully published. So there's a couple of interim reports which are largely focused on the Viking Age assemblage, and it's got a remarkable Viking Age assemblage, 2,000 finds. It's huge. There's much less earlier material. There's I don't think there's any import ware, but it's not necessarily in an area where we would expect to find it anyway. I don't know how well dated the ramparts are. I've got radiocarbon dates, so I don't have them to hand, which I think are going back to the 6th as a bit of 7th century material culture. But it's pretty unique. People like Nancy Edwards would know better than I, but I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of any other low-lying enclosures which are comparable and as well dated. We've got things like the Cornish rounds. I mean, they are perhaps broadly similar, but and those are, of course, they've got Roman, they're late Iron Age through to Roman, but again being abandoned probably in the 7th 7th century.
Probably just about that. Even though you winked out there for a second, at least at my end. One of the questions which, if we can nip back to the imports, given that we've got now this more nuanced idea of the nature of the Atlantic trade and the kind of diversity of the stuff that's coming, are we in a position to, Sally wants to throw out the question, are we in a position to start thinking better or harder about what is being traded south, what's coming from, what are they using to exchange for these amphora in places like Scotland and places like beyond, out once we get beyond the tin and the minerals in the southwest? Is there any kind of new thinking about that? Maybe start with Maria. I know it's...
I mean, for me, I've mostly been concentrating on the Mediterranean material, and I think the metals are the really driving aspect of that. This is what Ewan was stressing in his work as well. We're getting this increasing evidence of demand for tin because of really huge quantities of copper production in Cyprus coming through now. In terms of what's coming through within that kind of subsequent system, I'm less sure, and perhaps you might have some ideas on that. What's material coming from further north in Western Britain and Scotland and Ireland? Am I allowed to pass it on for some ideas?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suggested slaves as a big driving factor. I mean, when we know there's a lot of hostage taking and so on, and I think these systems just tapped into that. And, it was a major, as an easy cargo. And I even gave some, I think I gave some calculations on the profit you could make from taking, a hold of slaves back to the Mediterranean. It's quite extremely large.
Okay. It's not a very jolly thought, but there you go. Can I, now there's a couple of questions here I've slightly lost. There's some useful comments from Nancy Edwards about the dating and from Dave Griffiths about the form of Khan bedrock, which we might want to pick up. There was another question which I've slightly lost. Oh yes, so this is a question about so if we're thinking about the the dating horizon which you've picked up, Andy, of these Hillforts running out of steam at the end of the 7th century or thereabouts, is it a bit too early to think about what's driving that?
Yeah, well, I should also emphasize that with the ones in the southwest, obviously we don't have much of the continental imports, and they could be dropping out even earlier. Well, we don't have as many radiocarbon dates from those sites. Spaces like Canterbury Castle perhaps doesn't need to go much later than 600. And I do wonder about the overall length of activity at some of these sites, maybe perhaps a generation or two. And certainly some of the larger sites, such as Canterbury Castle, were clearly related to quite substantial and complex socio-political systems. There were people in command of considerable resources, and whether they were able to perpetuate that power over more than a couple of generations. So perhaps it's a kind of boom and bust economy, which they kind of fade out. But other things I think are interesting. We're towards the end of the 7th century. We're getting in towards what we call the long 8th century. So where we've got these sort of major economic transformation, shifts to more intensive forms of agriculture, changes in the nature of land holding, and changes in the nature of the church, which may also have had an impact. Perhaps some of the activities that people are doing at Hillforts become a bit too taboo in the later 7th century as the church becomes more powerful. That could be an answer. But also doing things on the top of cold hills is perhaps a little inconvenient, and maybe doing things in lower lying settings is a bit easier when political systems get larger and more complex. So certainly in the southwest, in Devon and Somerset, you can trace a network of magnate farms or estate centres, effectively manorial sites on the sort of 9th, 10th centuries. So whether they're coming in and replacing the Hillforts, which have kind of lost their main reason for being. But it certainly, I think ultimately we need more dates. It could be that we could date a lot more of these sites, and what we have are sequences going all the way through, and we don't have because I should say, obviously the work on the Scottish sites is now showing much greater evidence of continuity a bit later. So if we had more dates, maybe we would have more evidence of continuity.
Can I just add? I mean, a couple of factors that I thought about and put forward. Not everybody agrees with them. One was with the Mediterranean system, that noticeably the import stopped in the mid-6th century when the Great Justinian Plague is, and these boats would actually have been bringing rats with them with the plague, so specifically to these sites, and so there may have been, we know that many bishops and so on in Ireland were died of the plague at that time, presumably other high status figures. And the other thing I suggested was at the end of these trades, sort of took away some of the economic underpinning of the system that was going on in these power centres of redistributing this material, and so they lost their ability to control these luxury goods and keep other people as clients, and so that may be another factor going on as well.
Obviously, this is a kind of a big issue and a large debate kind of surrounds this, and it's really interesting to hear the kind of current thinking about that. I'd like to have one more question, and then we'll finish with a tribute. Alan Lane was wanting to know whether Maria had any thoughts about the security of Chris Morris's dates for the imports, the later dates, and whether the T-Carp dates actually reinforce the 5th, 6th century conventional dating.
Yeah, I won't get too much into the overall T-Carp excavation dating, because that's something that Jackie maybe could tell us about another time. Or in terms of the material, I think what I'm saying with the Mediterranean imports is it completely agreeing with what Ewan was saying. There is a possible sherd from the site. I think that might stretch into the later half of the 6th century, but that kind of 100 years between 450 and 550, everything that I've been seeing would comfortably fit into that, and very much within the late 5th to the first half of the 6th century for almost everything. Perhaps a couple of pieces that might just push it a little bit earlier, but I don't seem to be seeing anything really that's later. And in fact, that's typical for much of the Atlantic. This is one of these features where the British kind of character does match up with what we're seeing in the wider Atlantic. Mediterranean imports post the mid-6th century are pretty uncommon, really, apart from a few sites. Places like Vigo, and also places like Bordeaux and the Algarve.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Maria and Andy, for those very stimulating papers and the very informative discussion that you've contributed to afterwards. We really appreciate it, and it does underscore the influence that Ewan's had over a considerable period of time, and it's always encouraging to see this influence is still lively and constructive. And now I believe Adrian is going to share the screen, and so we have this shared screen. I mean, maybe Adrian, maybe I've missed something, but I don't have anything to read. Have I lost something here? I thought it was going to be on the
slide. We had a wee tribute that Jackie Nowakowski submitted. It's just a wee story about one of the ways in which Ewan stepped in to help identify some glass. Jackie, I know you're in the audience. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but did you just want to say a quick word?
I think she'd rather one of us do it, but
I was thinking that you could do it, but if you want me to do it, that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I think for me, it's been fascinating having both, well, working at Tintagel clearly, and but fascinating that Ewan got involved with our T-carp excavations in the last 2 years, since 19. Anyway, so we've been doing some recent, as Maria said, more recent work at Tintagel for English heritage, and finding an extraordinary range of materials. And it was the glass really that really struck me as being an under-recognised resource from Tintagel, because during the work that Chris Morris did there over 10 years in the 1990s, just a few sherds really of glass was found. And over our season, over 2 seasons of work, we found we've almost trebled that with these types of fragments of drinking vessels, beakers and bowls, which now have been looked at by our specialists, Dr. Sarah Painter at Historic England and Rachel Tyson, who's very kindly provided this photograph. And the scientific analysis shows that, the chemical analysis shows that we've got a natron glass originating from Egypt, which was probably transported to workshops in southern or southwest France. This material is reinforcing this Atlantic connectivity with Tintagel. This material is coming, you know, from sites along the Atlantic seaboard. So, and I guess it's really Ewan's work which has really helped us really understand a little bit more about the Atlantic seaboard connectivity, which is the work that Maria and all her colleagues in the Mediterranean are now promoting. So we are very lucky that Ewan and both Alan Lane and Ewan have been helping on the advisory panel for our project. And this is just a photograph of their visit in 2017 with my colleague Carl Thorpe, who's there in the picture as well, and Mark Bowden from Historic England, and Ewan's lovely daughter as well, who came to visit. And knowing how far Glasgow is from Cornwall, we were really very appreciative of his time and effort to come and see us. So just a little tribute. And thank you very much for the opportunity to do that as well.
Thank you, Jackie, and sorry we've crossed wires there. It's really nice to be able to show that active engagement. And I think that's what we all appreciate about the fact that we're archaeologists, that we can work with other people, and we can, there's a kind of constructivity which can take place if we're minded to do that. So this is maybe the right point to thank everyone for again, thank you once again to Maria and to Andy for their presentations today. Thank you for the participation of everyone else. And just before we go, Adrian, can you, well, I've got it right here. So the next one of these events is going to be happening on the 15th of December. And that's going to move the discussion on to looking at stone carving, or carving of, and so we're going to look at inscriptions. And so Professor Catherine Forsyth is going to be talking about the Dynad Ogham, revisiting that. And Adrian himself will be looking at the evidence for the import of stone for use of for making stone monuments to Iona, and particularly looking at Viking Age patronage. So these are on the agenda for the 15th of December, and we will also have more tributes to Ewan, because they keep tumbling in. So you can look forward to that too. So I guess we can do this, or we can do the other kind of symbolic thing, and thank you so much.